Welcome to the Compliance 911 Show, a no-nonsense podcast discussing hot topics for today's busy compliance professional. It's everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. And now, here are your hosts, Dean Stockford of M&M Consulting and Len Suzio of GeoData Vision.
Good morning, Len. So what interesting topics are you bringing for our podcast discussion today?
Well, Dean, one of the most challenging Community Reinvestment Act topics is community development. It's challenging because it's complicated and esoteric. It's also complicated by the minimal amount of reported data. Only community development lending is reported, and that information is very minimal. Neither the community development loan purpose nor its location are reported. And when it comes to community development investments and services, nothing is reported. Now, since performance evaluations are done based on what they call performance context, it's extremely difficult to evaluate community development performance. Consequently, a lot of CRA officers are always asking the question, hey, what do we need to do to get a satisfactory or outstanding performance rating for our community development activities? And unlike small business and small farm lending, there's no community development market data specific to any bank's assessment areas. Not only that, Dean, but it's also even more difficult to establish community development goals. It can be very frustrating, to say the least. And I can tell you, I've heard many complaints from banks that want to meet their CRA obligations, but feel like they are operating in the dark when it comes to community development responsibilities. Now, for the first time, a regulator, the OCC, has published proposed community development calibrated benchmarks. In December 2025, the OCC proposed 67 different potential community development lending, community development investing, and community development servicing benchmarks. The agency said it was proposing these, what they call elective benchmarks, for community banks with less than $30 billion of assets to use in a CRA strategic plan. It did caution that the proposed benchmarks were to be used only in strategic plans. But it also said the benchmarks were based on the OCC's experience, quote, in evaluating community banks' CRA performance under otherwise applicable performance tests and standards. So if the proposed benchmarks are based on years of CRA performance evaluations for strategic plans, as well as otherwise applicable performance tests and standards, that sounds to me like they would apply to banks that have not developed a CRA strategic plan. In any event, it's the best evidence we have into the minds of the bureaucrats who are charged with enforcement of the regulation.
That does sound interesting, Len. So where do you want to start? Are there, are you going to go through all of the, I'll say 67 benchmarks today?
No, my goodness, that would be impractical in a 15-minute podcast. But I do intend to go through how the benchmarks are organized, and I may touch upon a few of the proposed benchmarks to give our audience a preview of the details. At the end of this podcast, we will provide a link to a special document that GeoData Vision's prepared containing all 67 community development lending, investing, and service benchmarks, so our audience will be able to see every single one of those 67 potential standards.
Yeah, that sounds like a practical approach. So where do we start?
Well, the benchmarks are grouped by the three community development categories of activity. Number one, community development lending. Number two, community development investing. And number three, community development services. Although the benchmarks are grouped this way, there are several benchmarks that are proposed combined CD lending and CD investing. So technically, there are four groups of community development activity benchmarks. Now, within the four groups of community development activities, again, lending, investing, services, and the combined lending and investing, there are groups of proposed benchmarks for satisfactory and outstanding performance rating.
Okay, so hopefully I can understand this or unpack it. But so there's four different groups of community development activities. And then within each of those groups are the benchmarks grouped by performance rating?
Yes, you nailed it, Dean, right on the first try. I'm impressed.
To be sure, to be sure I followed, Len. I would have to say, let me repeat what I understand you're saying for our audience. The first group is community development lending, and subgroups for satisfactory and outstanding for performance benchmarks. The second group is community development qualified investing with subgroups for satisfactory and outstanding performance ratings. The third group is community development services with satisfactory and outstanding goals. And then finally, there's a fourth group that is combined community development lending and qualified investing, again, with satisfactory and outstanding performance benchmarks.
You nailed it, Dean.
Well, aside from those four CD activity groupings and the two proposed performance benchmark groupings for satisfactory and outstanding performance, are there any other groupings for the proposed performance benchmarks?
Yes, Dean. Within each community development activity and each proposed performance benchmark, the calibrated benchmarks are grouped by bank sizes. Keep in mind that we are talking about banks with $30 billion of assets or less. The bank grouping sizes are not quantitatively specified. They are descriptively grouped as one, small, less complex community banks. I would assume that this applies primarily to the intermediate small banks for CRA purposes. Number two, larger, more complex community banks. So these would be small, large banks, if you want to call it that. And then the larger banks, up to $30 billion, that are more complex and that include a broader statewide or regional area. I also should mention that the proposed benchmarks also include goals by assessment areas for banks that have multiple assessment areas.
So we're now talking benchmarks organized by three different groupings: your CD activity type, performance ratings, which are satisfactory and outstanding, and then three bank size. It sounds highly organized. So should I ask the next logical question? Are you going to tell us about more groupings?
Yes, I know you're on the edge of your seat waiting for this. The performance benchmarks are also delineated by Tier 1 capital per year and total assets per year and volunteer service hours per year per employee. Notice that they are all annual goals.
Yeah, it does sound highly organized, and it sounds like it gives banks a wide range of benchmarks. Dare I ask for an example or two?
Sure, Dean. For smaller banks, and I'll assume primarily for intermediate small banks, 1% of Tier 1 capital is proposed as an annual goal for a satisfactory community development lending, and it's 2% for an outstanding community development lending rating. For the largest banks, $30 billion at the max, the proposal suggests a 2% of Tier 1 capital as an annual benchmark for satisfactory community development lending and 3% for an outstanding performance benchmark. Now, again, there are benchmarks based on asset size as well as Tier 1 capital. Annual asset benchmarks for community development lending start at 0.08% to 0.24% of a bank's assets for satisfactory ratings for smaller banks, up to 0.40% for larger, more complex banks. When it comes to community development investment benchmarks, they are also proposed based on Tier 1 capital and asset size. The benchmarks for community development investment run from 0.25% of Tier 1 capital to 3% for satisfactory performance to as much as 5% of Tier 1 capital for outstanding performance for larger banks without a community development lending goal. There are various alternative combinations too. For example, there are community development lending goals for banks that don't have community development investment goals, and there are goals based on asset size, etc. Here at Geodata Vision, we plan on including these considerations when we conduct CRA performance reviews for our clients.
Yeah, it certainly sounds extremely comprehensive one.
I would say that's an understatement, Dean. Let me just recap since we've covered a lot, and I want to be sure that our listeners have a picture in their mind of the organizational structure of the performance goals. First, the benchmarks are organized by types of community development activity. Again, community development lending, community development investing, community development services. Second, there's benchmarks for satisfactory and outstanding performance ratings. Third, the benchmarks are delineated by 3 different bank size groupings that are descriptive, not quantitative. The maximum bank size is $30 billion in assets. Clearly, the smallest group would include the intermediate small banks. The line of demarcation for the other 2 groups is subjective. Notwithstanding this ambiguity, the proposed goals are still very helpful. And 4, finally, performance is measured using Tier 1 capital and asset size as reference points.
Well, I hope you've whetted our listeners' appetite. Where can they retrieve a recap of all the 67 goals?
Well, at the Geodata Vision website, which we will repeat the exact landing page on the Geodata Vision website, there's a recap of all 67 performance standards that has been proposed by the OCC. I would encourage our listeners to use them as reference points when they're trying to determine or evaluate their own community development performance.
Yeah, I always get a level of anxiety anytime we start talking about Community Reinvestment Act overall, and especially the community development components. And you do such a marvelous job of breaking things down for our audience. And of course, for me, who gets to discuss this with you. But excellent job today, Len. This is Dean Stockford with M&M Consulting.
And this is Len Suzio with Geodata Vision saying, we hope you enjoyed today's broadcast. We encourage you to send us your feedback and any ideas you may have for future podcasts.
Thanks for listening to the Compliance 911 Show. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. While you're at it, please give us a like and review to help others find the show. As always, links are in the show notes, and you can always find us online at compliance911show.com. Follow M&M Consulting and Geodata Vision on LinkedIn for all the latest news and information on compliance hot topics.